I can understand why the markets reacted the way they did. But I would
love it.
They absolutely, you know, globally, they absolutely love it. But my question would be, how much longer will they stay in love with this with this Draghi policy? And you know, we've seen in the past there have been some really enthusiastic responses by markets in the past to these kinds of policies. And you know, maybe one thing here is, maybe we're getting into a slightly different situation this time, because the timing is such that we're almost getting a situation where it's like a relay race and the baton is being passed from one central bank to another. And okay, that's been happening for the past few years, but you know, we're seeing all of that now kind of compressed just into the month of September, because we've got the Fed meeting next week, where people are expecting something to happen. So you know, even if the market starts to lose a little bit of enthusiasm for Draghi's plan by the middle of next week, then you know, maybe the Fed comes in, the Fed picks up the baton, that gives us another week or two, and we've got PBOC in China, the Chinese central bank, are you know, taking all sorts of policy measures pretty well every single day almost, and you know, no one really knows quite what they're up to, but we've seen them injecting liquidity into the market. Today they're taking it out of the market, which is a suggestion that they're going to cut interest rates. So you know, all the central banks seem to be sort of taking turns to, you know, pick up the baton, run with it for a while, pass it to another one. But the problem is, none of this is really solving any of the fundamental problems here. It's just you know, allowing bills to be paid in the short term. And I think, you know, one thing that reminds us of is anybody who's read about the 1920s would know that there was a real kind of cult, I suppose, of central bankers then. There were four central bankers who dominated the global economy at that time. Montague Norman from the Bank of England, Ben Strong from the Fed, Hjalmar Schacht in Germany, and Emile Moreau in France.
Just like now.
Very similar, exactly. Very similar situation now. There's a lot of parallels. But what's really interesting for us is that from the mid-1920s onwards, pretty well all of these characters were writing in their personal memoirs, you know, how worried they were about asset bubbles, how the inability to service debt was a real problem for all of them, and they were all, you know, warning about policy measures that would need to be taken from the mid-1920s to avoid things like the 1929 crash, things like the Great Depression. Even though they saw it coming, they weren't actually able to do anything about it. All the policies that they adopted were sort of immediate, short-term, reactive policies that dealt with the immediate problem, but didn't do anything to fix the structural problem. And I think there's a real danger that that's exactly where the central banks are now. Whether it's PBOC, whether it's Fed, whether it's ECB, I think all the central banks are in the same situation of just maybe playing a little bit to the gallery, because, you know, obviously last night was Draghi's big moment. You know, a week or two earlier he'd said, you know, I'm not going to let the euro go, I'm going to fix it at all costs, whatever it takes. Exactly, yeah. So last night was his big moment. He had to come up with something. But what he came up with was something that, you know, it sounded good. It sounded good last night. Maybe it'll still sound good next week. But I think in a month's time, you know, like all these other, 20-something ECB summits or Eurozone summits that they've had in the past couple of years, where they've all sat down and said, yeah, we've really got to fix this problem, guys. You know, I think a month or two later we might be looking at it and saying, kind of, you know, so what? You know, it seems to just get, the pressure seems to get more and more and more every time we come back to it. And so, you know, in a month's time, 2 months' time, we might be sitting here talking about Draghi's latest plan.
Right, and he may say, like, you know, whatever it takes, whatever things like that. Yeah. So, do you see any implications of the ECB plan to, like, you know, the FOMC meeting, or also, you know, other central banks meeting?
I think, you know, there's an extent to which the central banks are coordinating.
Does it send a signal together?
I think so. I think there's an element to which, you know, they're coordinating. We have to understand that there's you know, a real closeness between the central bankers. They're in constant communication. You know, I remember when Kun Tarisa was at the Bank of Thailand, and she said that, you know, all the regional central bankers would speak, you know, pretty well every single day about what they were doing and what their policies were. And I think, you know, on a global level, it's very similar. I'm sure, you know, I would imagine that you know, Ben Bernanke had some idea what Mario Draghi was going to say before he went out and said it last night. So I think there's an element of this, and I think that, you know, maybe they all try to, you know, assist each other in achieving their aims. So I'd be surprised if next week, you know, Bernanke does anything to undercut what the ECB have done. The real question, I suppose, now is that if the markets carry on responding so positively to this latest for the Fed to act so aggressively next week, because I think we see that from all the tensions within the Fed at the moment, some people saying we really need to take aggressive action, some people being more passive, some people being completely opposed to any more stimulus because they don't think it's working. From all these tensions within the Fed, it almost seems like there needs to be some excuse. Bernanke needs a really good excuse to introduce either QE or twist or whatever it may be.
But you believe there will be some measurement, measures, stimulus package?
I'm sure they'll do something because they're